back to Housebuild TV. This evening we're going to touch on part B1, means of escape for dwellings. Welcome back, Geoff Wilkinson from Wilkinson Construction and Eoghain Ryan from Ryan Associates and housebuild.co.uk. Thanks for joining us again, Geoff, this evening, and let's get started on part B.
Yeah, so let's start on part B. This is probably the biggest and most complicated of all the approved documents out there. So what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and focus on narrowing this down as much as we can. And as you quite rightly said, what we're going to do today is just focus on houses to start off with, because if we start getting into houses of multiple occupation or flats or anything else, it's going to get very, very messy very, very quickly. So we're just purely focusing tonight on the very straightforward. It starts off with one paragraph. I'll read the paragraph for you. The building shall be designed and constructed so there are appropriate provisions for early warning of fire, appropriate means of escape in case of fire to a place of safety outside the building, capable of being safely and effectively used at all material times. So that's the bit that you are expected to comply with. It then starts to get a touch more complicated than that. But the first thing that you need to do is you need to provide a way of giving an early warning in case of a fire occurring. This typically is what we refer to as smoke detectors. It could be smoke detectors, it could be heat detectors, and there are a huge range of detectors out there. The minimum standard for a standard dwelling, your base standard for a dwelling, is what's known as a grade D2 category LD3 smoke detection and fire alarm system to BS 5839 part 6. One of the first things that we regularly get are people confusing part 6, which deals with dwellings, and part 1 that deals with non-dwellings. So you can often find that people will go out there and they're just really not sure of what type of fire alarm they're actually looking for, what the specification is. So what they're looking for is 5839 part 6, and the minimum standard is this grade D2 LD3. So what on earth does that all mean, you're going to be asking? Are we ready for this? So a grade D2 is a system of one or more mains powered detectors, each with an integral standby supply. So what does that actually mean in day to day? So basically it means the mains power supply to the detector itself, and there's a battery supply in there, so that in the event of mains failure, the battery will continue to operate and give you coverage in the event of that mains failure. So I say that's really the very base level. A lot of time clients will potentially go to any of the well-known hardware stores. I won't name any of them just in case they're not linked to your website, but there are plenty of well-known hardware stores out there, and they'll go and buy a £5 detector that's just battery operated. They are not suitable. Okay, it has to be a fully mains wired system, and it should be installed by an electrician and certified by an electrician. Okay, so let's make sure that you're starting off with that. So when we actually look at that in more detail, I also mentioned something called LD3. Okay, so what does LD3 mean? LD3 is about the coverage of how many places you're putting the detectors. So where do you put the detectors? Okay, and the absolute minimum, which is the LD3 standard, is basically within escape routes themselves. So let me explain what an escape route is for the purposes of this. Typically it's your landings, your hallways, it's the corridors, so not the rooms themselves, but the circulation space. So that's the anticipation, is that is the minimum standard that you would normally have within the building, and potentially a heat detector in the kitchen. Okay, so that would be pretty much your standard requirement for basically your bog standard, very simple, 2 up, 2 down type house.
Geoff, just in Ireland, that's been upgraded to an LD2. Just so an LD2 is a higher level of coverage, and LD means L is for life safety and D is a domestic setting. So just to keep it simple for people, but an LD2 requires in Ireland that we provide smoke detection within bedrooms as well.
Yeah,
because where there's a sleeping risk. But till about 3 years ago, it was exactly the same. It was an LD3 was your minimum standard.
That's interesting because technically, that's not what LD2 necessarily says. What it says is that it's all escape routes and any high risk areas.
Yeah.
So if you had, for example, the kitchen, you definitely need that covered. If you've got a living room or something of that kind, where you might have an open fire and you consider that to be the case, then you would have escape routes plus high. Whilst we're on the whole, the changes that have occurred between the last set of updates that we had in the UK and the latest set of updates, if you're going through and you've got an old copy of the approved documents for England and Wales, well, for England, you'll find that some of them refer to a grade B fire alarm system. Grade B was withdrawn from the British standard, so you can't, even if you wanted to, get a grade B system. So basically, you either have a grade D, which is the fire alarms that effectively are mains wired and interlinked, and I'll explain more about that in a second, or you have one that goes back to a panel, okay, more like the type that you would have in that you're likely to see in your offices, places of work, etc. So that fully monitors the system, and it can tell you whether there are any faults or flaws or anything of that kind. So that's very much the base standard. Oh, that was the other thing. Let's just run through the smoke alarms talk to each other business. So that's what we refer to as interconnected. So one of the critical bits of the fire alarm system is that when a detector goes off in one room, it sounds the detectors throughout the whole of the building. Okay, so they link through. One of the questions we get asked quite frequently are, and I'm sorry to drop a brand in here, but I'm going to have to, are Google Nest detectors acceptable? The answer to that is maybe, and maybe not. So it depends, again, what standard you're actually looking for. When we're talking about a mains wired interconnected system, we're normally talking about there actually being physical cables between the detectors, and when one goes, effectively it sends the signal to the other one. The Google Nest system works on the basis of utilizing your Wi-Fi hub. So there's no actual connection between them. You connect it up, you've got power to it, and it will then tell the other detector using your Wi-Fi there is a fire, and off it goes. The problem with that is if your Wi-Fi goes down, your detectors go down. So you'll potentially have one detector go off, but you won't have this interconnection between the others. Additionally, the Google Nest system doesn't have a heat detector, and there's a general expectation, as I've said, that you're going to have a heat detector in the kitchen. So therefore, the Google Nest system is just simply not compliant with those bits. Certainly, if you go to the Scottish regs, they're quite clear. They actually state quite clearly that the Google Nest system is not appropriate. So can you have a system of fire alarm whereby you don't have the physical interconnection? And the answer to that is yes, you can. But it requires a proper a radio connection between each of the detectors, and that to have in itself a battery backup, so that in the event of there being a fire or being a power cut, etc., there will still be that interconnectivity between the detectors.
Geoff, the battery backup and that, or the minimum battery life of those ones, the wireless systems, which are being used and being promoted in some areas, especially retrospectively in existing buildings, is you have to have a minimum battery life of 10 years, isn't it? And it has to be maintained on a annual and maybe quarterly basis, depending on the premises.
So again, it depends on whether it's just your dwelling, your own home. Englishman's home is his castle, and so on and so forth. But if you're letting it, and I'm desperately going to try and avoid talking HMOs, etc., where something completely different applies. But basically, if you're letting the property, or it's a holiday let, or it's any of these other things, other than it's just your family home, then potentially different things apply, and that's where you need to then be potentially licensed in the same way that there's a requirement for you to get your boilers serviced annually. There's a requirement to get your electric checked annually when you're providing something to someone else. And whilst it's obviously a hugely good idea to get them checked on your own house, it's not actually a legal requirement to get them serviced. So that's your basic kind of standard. So a lot of the time that could mean just literally one detector on the landing at ground floor, one detector on the landing at first floor, and a heat detector in the kitchen, for example. If you've got a slightly larger house, then you may find you actually need to put more detectors in, because in addition to the first part of the requirement, which is detection in those areas, you need to ensure that the detectors are sited no more than 7.5 meters from any doorway. So if you've got a corridor that runs down your property and it's say 10 meters long, depending where you're actually proposing to site them, you might need to have 2 detectors in order to ensure that you're not more than 7.5 meters away, or at least you'd have to site it more centrally in that particular case. Whilst we're on the subject of siting the detectors, they should really be at the highest point of the ceiling. So if you've got a sloping ceiling, they should be up towards the top of the sloping ceiling, not down at low level. The reason primarily behind that is that what will happen is smoke will filter up, and then if you imagine you've got an angle, you've got a triangle, it will take time for the smoke to come down to get to the point where the detector would then operate. So it should always be, as I say, at the highest point of an apex. It also, though, needs to be 300 millimeters away from lights or walls or obstructions. And again, if you've got maybe a downstand beam in the layout that you've got in your hallway, there's a deep beam that sits through, then you might need to have one either side of the downstand beam to ensure that you've got coverage. Then as you go up and you start getting to bigger and bigger houses, when we start getting into those gorgeous grand design things that you see on the telly, and that everyone, the sort of place that you're in, Ryan, that sort of huge, luxurious mansion with the colonnades out the front.
I have to tell my butler not to interrupt me here.
Quite right as well. Quite right as well. But when you get to a large dwelling house, and a large dwelling house, there are technically 2 definitions of large dwelling house, but we'll start off with a large dwelling house that's 2 stories in height, which is where you then go up to a grade A LD3 alarm. And if you go to a very large dwelling house, which is 3 or more stories in height, then you go to a grade A LD2. Now, the expectation when we're talking about large is that any story in there is 200 meters squared. So just to put that, it's 10 meters by 20 meters. So it is quite substantial. But as you start going up, so you start needing to add into these relevant standards. So going back to the point we're making about LD2 is adding detectors in. So you really want to try and ensure that you're making the correct provision. Otherwise, the building inspector will come round and go, hang on a second, you're going to need to put another one in there. So always ask the question early doors. ideally make sure it's shown clearly on the plans that you submit and have them checked and approved before you start. But always make sure that you check with the inspector, because sometimes when you look at the plans, it's not obvious, as I say, that there's a beam on the, so someone's giving you a reflected ceiling plan and hasn't actually put the downstand beam on it, or hasn't put the fact that it's actually angled. So it's indicative a lot of the time on a plan rather than actual.
Have you seen sign off being delayed because of that? Has it been
Yeah.
or is it just once? Is it common occurrence?
It's a fairly common occurrence that, particularly as we then go into some of the slightly more complex bits. So if you're then, one of the things that you can do, and we haven't really talked about the means of escape side of stuff at the moment, we just talked about the warning. One of the things that you can do is you can start to vary other provisions by putting in enhanced detection. So let me just try and explain the very sort of first part of that. So the first idea really is that you want to know as soon as possible that you've got something that's caught fire. Okay, that will set the alarms off, and they need to be sufficiently loud to wake you, because let's assume you've gone to bed, you've had a couple of pints, maybe it was Paddy's Day just recently, you've had quite a few pints at that point, you've gone to bed and you've left a pan on or something. So that's the reason why we ideally want to have a heat detector in the kitchen, so it's going to pick it up whilst it's in the kitchen. But let's say you'd left a cigarette lit in the lounge, for example. That fire won't actually activate the detector until the smoke from the fire gets to the detector. Now, if you've only got detection in your escape route, then that's telling you there's smoke in your escape route, and that's going to make it more difficult for you to get out of the building. So a lot of the time, clients are really anti putting smoke detectors in, which I never. People love a flat ceiling and they hate the idea of this thing sitting on the ceiling, and they just look horrible and can't be having it. But they're there to help protect you and your family. So what you've got to remember is that if you do go down to the absolute minimum in every case, and you've just got one on the landing on one floor and one on the landing on another floor, the fire could have got to quite a large size, and smoke is getting into the staircase before that alarm operates. Having operated, it's then telling you that the fire itself, smoke is in the staircase. And in most cases, it's somewhat overgeneralization, but in most cases, it's the smoke that will kill you. It's not the fire that will kill you. As soon as you get those products of combustion going into your lungs, you'll start to, you effectively, it's quite like getting drunk, actually. It starts to mess up your mindset. You start to feel a bit drowsy. You start to feel woozy. You'll fall over. You'll lose consciousness. And then it will continue to go into your lungs. And then basically you will end up unable to breathe. And that's the point at which your body will then get consumed by fire. It's a happy session, this one.
Like people don't realize that. People need to realize that as little as 5 parts per million in air of carbon monoxide over a 5-minute period is enough to kill someone. So it's an asphyxiant as well as a narcotic. So as Jeff says, you're getting drunk, but you're choking yourself. So it's like people need to realize that smoke is in general what kills in domestic settings. It's not the fire, because generally the fire can stay contained within a room and may get outside the room of origin. By at that stage, the fire department may be there and maybe extinguish it. But if you, like me, had a lot on Paddy's Day, you may not wake up to the alarm, and you could be 5 minutes of carbon monoxide in your system. So it's
exactly. And by the same token, you might have 2 or 3 kids that you've got to herd together and try and get them awake and down the stairs. Or you might have an elderly relative that would be using a stair lift or whatever. So you've got to remember that this is the absolute minute. It will give you a warning. And one of the things that has been very consistent is that since the requirement to put mains wired fire alarms in, fire deaths have come down from the levels that they were 20 odd years ago to a much lower level. So the intervention requiring mains wired smoke detectors has been a huge contributor to life safety. So it has made a massive difference in the short period of time, as I say, that's been done. So as I say, so that brings those together. But the more detectors that you put in, so if you go for what we refer to as an LD1 system, which is to essentially every room or space apart from those like bathrooms or saunas or things of that kind, particularly where they're likely to be getting a false alarm from steam, for example, and are relatively low risk areas. You wouldn't necessarily put a smoke detector in those, but otherwise what we tend to refer to as full coverage. So that's a very quick run through of the first part of the equation. So you've now woken up. How do you get out of your building? So in the case of a bungalow, not that we see many of those being built, but there are still occasionally bungalows that we do see. That is a relatively simple one because you're on the ground floor. You can potentially have an opening window. You can get straight out the window. You can get straight out the door. You can get out and away. However, one of the things that even on those is sometimes forgotten is that if you are escaping out, where do you go to from there? So sometimes we'll see situations where the design of the building has got an escape route, but the escape route is into a back garden, for example, or it's into an enclosed courtyard, or you've even seen ones where it's like we've seen ones with basements and it's just into a light well at that point. It's like, oh, well, I've got out the window, but now where do I go to from here, kind of thing. So it's important to understand it's not just getting out of the room, it's getting to a place of ultimate safety. Now, the minimum consideration generally here is that you can get at least the height of the building away from the building. So if you had a building that was 2 stories, let's say for the sake of argument, it's 7.5 meters to the upper level, you would want to be able to get at least 7.5 meters away from it to ensure that you've got any degree of safety, because otherwise, if that building does start to collapse, bits start coming down off the roof's caught fire, you've got tiles and battens and goodness knows what landing down into your garden, you want to be as far away from that as possible. Ideally, you want to be in a position where you can escape into a rear alleyway, or you can get around the side of the building and you can get away and out so that you're to the street, and you could go to Land's End if you so chose, so that you can get as far away as you possibly can from the fire. And obviously that with increased height that becomes ever more important. So the other thing that often gets forgotten even in those are where you have a room that escapes through another room. Now, we have seen some really bizarre arrangements on these. Examples of this can be people creating home offices that escape through the kitchen area. So they don't come off the corridor itself, they just escape into the kitchen area. Well, the kitchen area is a place of higher risk than the office, so you would need an escape window directly out of that. You can't come through a room to get out. You go from a room into a common escape area, not to go from a room to a room to a room. There are some small exceptions to this, so en suites and walk-in wardrobes we would exclude from that because they're a room. It's just you've walked into a cupboard in the room, basically. They're not like risky, but if you're escaping from one room into another, you've got a problem.
It's essentially habitable areas, and like it's mad. Like habitable rooms shouldn't be inner rooms in these kind of buildings. But I won't name the building, but there was a renovation done on an apartment on a building to make them into apartments recently, and I was asked to go out and inspect post the work being completed, and it was over 4 levels, and it was an old the 19th century building, and all the bedrooms were opening off the kitchen. So I had to say, look, lads, you don't comply, you have to go back to the drawing board. And they were hoping to get this place signed off. And yeah, with the local authorities said, lads, I can't help you here.
Yeah, so there can be situations where there are alternative solutions to these things. So there was some research done by an organisation called the National House Builders Council, NHBC, and that was incorporated into, in part, into British Standard 9991, which talks about the use of fire suppression systems in the access room to help prevent the risk that you would have. So there are occasions when you can come up with an alternative design to that. Now, going back to our earlier point about, oh, well, sometimes you can enhance the detection and that will give you an earlier warning. So you put extra detectors in and that allows you to extend your travel distance, etc. One of the classics for that is there was a guide produced by the Construction Products Association, called it the Guide to Loft Conversions. They put all of the building. If you're thinking of doing a loft conversion, there is a handy guide that just compiles all of the bits together in one. It's still, from memory, about 270 pages long. So you're much better just going to your website and you can find everything that you need to find a hell of a lot easier there than you can within that document. But one of the things that they did was that they started to introduce additional options, such as these enhanced detectors. And I'll explain more about that when I start going on to the next bit, which is when we add a story. So we've now got a ground floor and we've got a first floor. So a simple 2 up, 2 down type terrace dwelling. We've all seen them. There's lots of these typically about. So in these buildings, you either need a protected stairway, or instead of having a protected stairway, you can have escape windows from the first floor, which enable you to basically lower yourself down to the ground level. Bear in mind, if you're going for that option, you would want to be physically fit and able to do those things. Again, if you actually think when you're making these decisions as to which system you're going for, ideally, a protected stair, by the way, let me just explain a protected stair. So a protected stair means that the entrance hall, your landings, your corridors, all of the doors between that and the room are fire doors. Okay, so the idea there is that in the event that there's a fire in, say, the living room, the fire will start in the living room, the fire door will hold the fire back in the living room, and it will give you a period of time, theoretically, probably 20 minutes, and I'll explain why it's 20 minutes in a moment, ideally 30 minutes, but that's a theoretical test figure in any case, but it will give you a period of time in which you can sort of round up the kids, round up granny, and get them down and out. If you've gone for the escape windows, bear in mind that you are going to have that staircase not protected against fire. So fire and smoke can be breaking into the staircase itself. It's woken you up, it said off you go, but you're now going to have to get you and granny out of the first floor window down 2.5, 3 meters to the ground level. That is the decision that you're making if you're going that way. It's compliant with the regulations, so you can have escape windows rather than these fire doors. But do you really want to have escape windows rather than fire doors? Question that I would ask somewhat rhetorically. I know what I would probably be choosing if I were designing it myself. That said, most people live in buildings that don't have fire doors. So going back to the fire doors themselves, I said that the minimum standard in England is a FD20 door. When we're talking about FD20, FD is basically fire door, and 20 is the number of minutes that door is expected to last. That is the minimum standard that you can have. From a practical point of view, there are very few 20-minute fire doors that are actually produced and available on the market. Most manufacturers will make their doors 30 minutes. So if you really want to go to 20 minutes, you're going to limit the choice of fire door that you've got. So if you have a particular view that you want a nice paneled type door, then you may not get that. If you want a like ledged and braced style door, you may not necessarily get that. So you're going to have a limitation on the type of doors that you're going to be able to use. So bear that in mind as to what ones you're specifying.
Just in regards to that, Geoff, sorry to cut across you, just people think it's just the door itself. And people need to realize a fire door is a full assembly. It's the door, it's the frame, it's the hinges, it's an intumescent strip, and it's self-closer. So it's not that, and it's how that is fitted within the wall, the wall, whether it's a stud wall or a concrete wall. That all contributes to whether it meets that 20 or 30 minutes. And if it's not done properly, or there's a weakness in the system, then that door is not fit for purpose. And people just think, oh, I bought a fire door. A fire door is a lot more than the door blank itself. And people, it's just something that people gloss over and think, oh, I bought a fire. It's not as simple as that.
Absolutely. So when we're talking about fire doors, we're talking about fire door assemblies as opposed to just literally the door itself. So it should, when you're actually looking to spec these up, you want to check what the test certificate is. One of the things I mentioned that these are FD20 doors or FD30 doors. Quite often they'll have the letter S attached to them as a test certificate. Now, technically, in England, it's not a requirement for a two-story house to have an FD30S door, but a lot of them will have been pre-routed out, ready to have the S part. Now, the S means it's a smoke stop door, so it helps prevent any smoke getting into the staircase as well. So what you've got to look at is on the test certificate, is that a valid test certificate if you've left out the intermittent or the smoke seal from it? So what you'll often have, we often regularly say, is you go around and the bloke goes, oh, well, it's not an FD30 door, so I didn't bother to put the intermittents or the smoke seals on it. Yes, but has it been tested as anything without it? Because if not, you're invalidating the test certificate by doing these things.
And what we see regularly is people go and plane the door for a certain type of floor finish, and the cert for the door says it's limited to maybe a 3 or 5 mil gap beneath the door. Some doors may be tested to a higher gap beneath the door, but people have them plain because they're going to put it in carpet or timber floor, and then they change their mind. The next thing you know, they have a large gap under the door, and I've seen it as bad as up to 25-30 mil, which is essentially.
You're almost limboing at that point.
There's loads of light coming through, so it's a bit. You have to put in a door saddle or a drop seal to try and counteract it. But people look, there's small things, and it happens regularly, and people just don't know the implications, and that's the long and short of it. It's not blame for anyone. There's no blame here. It's just trying to get people to be cognizant of the fact that it does affect the door.
Absolutely. And I said, just as a very, very general rule, if you take a pound coin and just run it around the gaps of the door, that will give you a good idea of whether it's been fitted accurately or not. I will talk about this more on another occasion, but one of my big bugbears is people using expanding pink foam everywhere around it. So what they'll do is that they'll put the door in, but when they put the door in, it's not quite where they wanted it. So what they'll do is they'll move it across by another, so they'll reframe it, and they'll move it across by another 50 mil, for example. But rather than actually reframing it properly, what they'll do is they'll pack that area out with expanding pink foam. The problem with expanding pink foam is it has the words fire or fire resistant or whatever written on it. It's not. Okay, it's purely there for a linear gap seal. Now, when we talk about linear gap seals, we're talking about a gap of maybe 5 to 10 millimeters. If you're putting it into anything more than about 5 to 10 millimeters, it's never been tested for that. So one of the critical bits for anything that you do with fire, always check that the product that you're using is suitable for the application you're actually using it in.
Oh, Jeff, that's a big bugbear of mine. And the other thing about it, people have to know that if it's applicable, suitable for use. So that pink foam is not suitable for use in flexible walls. And flexible walls, for people here who don't may not know this, are timber stud or metal stud walls. It means that wall can shift slightly. So that's called a flexible wall. And a timber floor is called a flexible floor. That particular product is not tested in that type of, even for a linear gap, it's in masonry construction to tie up like above concrete walls and different gaps around them, but not in a flexible wall. So you have to know that the product is fit for purpose and test to that particular detail. Other than that, it doesn't comply and it's not certifiable.
Absolutely. So, one thing that you did mention, you mentioned the word self-closes. So, in a house, okay, there used to be a requirement for in England for the doors to have self-closes on them. So that's one of the things that makes them shut automatically. That was removed several iterations of the regs ago. So it's no longer a requirement to have self-closes. The doors that we're talking about are not those horrendous things that you see in hospitals and stuff with a big metal overarm closer on them. And you don't also need what was commonly referred to as a Perco closer, which is the little spring-loaded thing that's little chain in the back of the door, for example.
I fully agree with that. I fully agree with that because I know in Ireland, in our jurisdiction, we still look for it. And the thing is, it leads to people wedging doors open. And that gives rise, particularly on the kitchen door, where the risk is that they wedge the door open and then that allows the fire and smoke to travel directly into your means of escape. And it's particularly in apartments more so than dwelling houses. And you're counteracting the good of providing a fire door. People go to sleep, they close the door, they don't keep them wedged open. But by providing the self-closer means people inherently, because it slams quickly behind them, they keep them wedged open. And like common sense has prevailed in the UK. We still don't have that bit of common sense here, even though I know we've petitioned a number of people in the powers to be to say, look, this doesn't work and it actually affects fire safety.
So there are two major reasons why it was removed when it was looked at. So the first one is people, generally speaking, did one of two things, which you say is either A, wedge it open, or B, just disconnect it. You can almost invariably walk around a house 2 days after it's been signed off, and someone will have gone around and they just undid the self-closers. Builders would literally turn around to you and tell you, well, as soon as you've gone, mate, I'll take it off. It's like, well, look, I've seen the evidence. It was there. It was fixed. If you then take it off afterwards, that's down to you. But I can't sanction you for doing it. I can only sign this off when it's connected, but I'm going to disconnect it. No, you're not. And it's important to so again, that's when we got flats. In apartments, for example, we do require self-closers, but in a dwelling you don't. And the second principal reason for that was for kiddies' fingers. So a lot of the time the doors would slam and catch the kids' fingers between the back of the door and the heavy duty door and the frame. So because of those reasons, we basically went, look, this just doesn't really make any sense. It's not an effective regulation. And I think that's one of the critical differences, and one of the things that I'm really sort of quite supportive of and really quite keen on, is that the regulations are actually effective. If people just are working their way round them constantly, it's like, why are we doing that? Is there a better way of doing it? So what it says now is that the expectation is that you'll have a handover document at the end of the project. The stuff that's being added to these handover documents. If you imagine when you buy a car, you get a manual to the car that explains all the things, how they work and what you do. So the idea is that you will have one of those for your house that explains how all of the various bits work. And one of the bits that's contained in there is that at night when you go to bed, you close those fire doors. So it should tell you which doors are fire doors. Okay. Quite often you can look on the top of the door or in the style of the door. There could be a sticker at the top. It may well be taken off. A number of times we see the stickers are taken off or the door's playing down, it's gone. Yeah. So it's trying to evidence that it is. You also should be able to look on the hinges. The hinges are likely to say they're certifier hinges, and there's likely to be 3 of them rather than 2 of them. Okay, so those are things that are likely to indicate to you that in your particular house, these are the fire doors. They're the ones you should keep shut of a night. So that's how it's moved on. So we now progress on to a 2-story and a loft, or a 2-story plus a full story, so a 3-story building. So effectively there are 3 levels to it. At this point, the option for the escape window disappears. Historically, the old building regulations used to allow you to have a loft area that you could sort of scramble down the roof of and then drop down or be rescued by ladder from. So that has been removed over the years, and you now have to have the fire door option. Okay, that is the only option for the 3 floors, unless you're going into one of the fire engineered solutions. So one of the things that we see an enormous amount of is people have watched grand designs or interior designers or anything else, and they come in and they want to have a big open plan ground floor. Now, the whole point of your fire escape stair is that the fire escape stair takes you from the top floor all the way down and to a final exit. Okay, so your front door in most cases. If you have a big open plan area and the staircase discharges into the middle of that open plan area, then a fire in that area cuts off your means of escape. So you've got to then come up with an alternative solution. And that's where sometimes a misting system can be proposed. You might have a situation where you have a cut-off door between the ground floor and the first floor, which enables you to still use the escape windows from the first floor. Or you could have it semi-open plan, so you get the effect of open plan, but you might get something called a fire curtain or a smoke curtain that drops down to create the corridor from the bottom of the staircase out. They're all complex solutions, so there are other ways of complying other than just the fire doors, but you really should be engaging with the fire engineer to discuss those.
Would they be common, Geoff? Like I wouldn't think that a fire curtain would be common in any kind of dwelling.
Yes, absolutely. It's particularly on alterations to existing dwellings at the moment. For whatever reason, whether it's an architectural fad or it's just people have watched all these lovely programs, they don't want to come into a corridor. So you come through your front door and then you're just into a bit of corridor, then you go into it. So I would say we probably get inquiries. I mean, we deal with about 60 projects a month. I would say at least 5 or 6 of those 60 projects will want to take some alternative approach, whether it's the misting system, whether it's the smoke curtain, whether it's cut-off door. But the demand is absolutely there for this open plan kind of arrangement.
Yeah, no, we would do similar amount of projects, but it would I'd say 3 or 4 a year with regards to maybe the local authorities in Ireland as receptive. But the curtain one, you would probably need a bulkhead, so would probably take away from the aesthetic anyway, would it not? I'd say the misting system
you can drop it into the floor. You can drop it into the floor. So from an aesthetic point of view, you can it can get to the point. I mean, it depends on the depth of the floor and how you arrange the bulkhead, etc., etc. But potentially you could get into that so that it's just almost like a shadow gap around it. So it is one of the potential options. Then
just one thing there, just to maybe highlight to listeners and people watching this, is that we've seen, and I know many times you'll have seen this as well, people have gone ahead and done an attic conversion, and they're there, I need to just put in a fire door at the loft level.
Yeah.
If you do this, it has to go the whole way down. So particularly if you're doing an old Georgian building or something that has beautiful features and beautiful doors, if you convert to a loft conversion, you have to upgrade all those doors. And a lot of the time it's not possible to do that. So you're actually potentially ruining the look and feel of your house by providing a loft conversion. And it's something that people retrospectively they don't foresee this at the start, but they come in after the fact. Look,
So, I mean, that opens up a wide range of discussions. First of all, on the historic nature of the building and getting listed buildings consent for it. There are products on the market that you can use to upgrade a door, but it will depend on the nature of the door itself. So if you have like a raised and fielded panel to it, a lot of the time the panel thickness might be down to like 3 or 6 mil in places, and that really makes the door sort of unsuitable. If it's slightly more chunky, then it may well be that you can potentially upgrade. So they're still not certified fire doors, but there is a system that can be used. There are a number of manufacturers out there that produce paint systems, paper and varnish systems. So there are things you could potentially do. Historically or traditionally, what people used to do was screw a sheet of asbestos on the back of the door, on the risk side, and that up. I just looking at the look of Sharon's face there, it's like, oh, what did you said? What? That was still being done in the 1980s and into sort of late 80s, possibly into the 1990s. People were still fixing sheets like that. So just as a warning, if you do actually see this sheet of something that's been screwed to the back of the door, do check as to whether or not that is asbestos, because that was one of the ways that people used to upgrade these doors in order to overcome it. We don't accept that as a solution anymore, but that was something, as I say, that certainly up until I started in 83, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't until the late 80s or early 90s that it was actually formally banned in England. So it's shocking how many buildings will still have asbestos. I've gone completely off track on approved document page. We're running out of time. So the things that I need to continue on are, if you then add, so we've now gone to 3 stories, need to have the protected stair. When we get to 4 stories, then you need to sprinkler the building or consider a alternative escape route. Okay, so that could be, now a lot of the properties in London, traditionally we were talking about those lovely sort of Georgian terrace houses and stuff. A lot of the time they used to have an arrangement whereby you'd escape to your neighbour's property, across the roof and then down their staircase and out their property. That kind of arrangement still exists on lots of the properties in central London. But if you add a story on, then you take that out for a start. And secondly, in most cases, you would expect to you would have an issue about having the legal right to actually enter into your neighbour's property these days. Again, I don't really want to go on blocks of flats, but lots of blocks of flats from including the early sort of 1990s, so 1980s, 1990s, still had what we referred to as an interchange balcony. So if there was a fire in your flat, you would go onto your balcony, you'd go across the balcony that you shared with your neighbour, and you'd go in through your neighbour's flat in order to escape, or to steal their large screen TV, as the case may be now. So so we don't now see that. So you do need to ensure that you have the ability to use the escape route at all material times, and that really is something that we need to mention.
Just one thing that I know people listening would want to ask: if you're it's like no one can hold you or anyone to this, but say a ballpark figure when you're dealing with clients and they want to put on a floor or they want to put in a loft and it triggers the sprinkler system to 9251. What would typical cost to retrofit that be in it? Would it be 15,000, 20,000, or is it a lot less or more? It all depends on the science of nature as well.
Yeah, it really, I mean, it is one of those kind of ballpark figures. If you're looking at, so potentially you can get to a situation where you have what's referred to as partial coverage. Okay, now I'll very briefly explain partial coverage. So to start off with, the core concept of sprinklers is that you have it throughout the whole building, so all areas. That's kind of your standard. You can potentially, particularly if you're doing alterations to an existing building, a loft conversion or something of that kind, then you can potentially get away with partial coverage, whereby you might only sprinkle the ground floor because that's the area where the risk is, provided all of the other areas are fully compliant. So you may, and just say you may, be able to get dispensation to allow for partial coverage. I appreciate we are starting to run tight on time. So just as you then add any more stories after that, then you do then start to get to the point of needing 2 escape routes or a fully fire engineered, fully detailed system. So that basically is kind of running you through at electrifying pace the real basics of B1 for dwelling houses, which are fire alarms. The more detectors that you've got, the better. If you have got a single story, then you can potentially get away with escape windows. If you've got a 2-story, you might potentially get away with escape windows. Once you get to 3 stories, you basically need either the fire doors or you'll need an alternative system. Once you get to 4 stories, you're going to need fire doors and sprinkler system. Once you go over that, you're likely to need 2 escape routes. So that's a really, really simplified version of B1. And next time we can either start talking about some of the other bits to do with part B and fire on houses, or we could open up the longest discussion you can imagine on flats, HMOs, and other non-standard dwelling types. But we look forward to that in coming weeks. Tune back.